One of the things that you learn through sports is talent is sort of God-given, but your ability to perfect that talent so that you turn it into being highly skilled. And when you're highly skilled and you've got an opportunity to display that you're highly skilled, it's very hard for people to block your entry into rooms and into sitting at tables where your skills demand that you should be in that room.
Hi, I'm Nick Warner. As a dad, a lucky husband, and as a business coach, I value people and relationships above all else. But next is winning, sustainability, and healthy culture. I've been a business owner for 25 years and served for decades as a special advisor to business and government leaders at all levels. Let's just say I've seen some stuff. My passion and my expertise are helping motivated professionals and businesses find the highest level confluence of what they want in life and business. This is what it feels like to be together at the top. Thank you to our sponsors, Scholl's Brick and Rogaski, Three Bridges Consulting, Kathy Olson at Ships and Trips, and Connect Strategies. Janus Norman is the president of the California Broadband and Video Association, better known as CalBroadBand. As you know, Together at the Top loves young, dynamic, and growing leaders, and we sure have one today in Janus. I met Janus when he was in his mid-20s as a budget writer and negotiator in the California State Legislature. Today, Janus is in his mid-40s with 20-plus years of experience at high levels of government and the state legislature, organized labor, the judiciary, and chief justice, and now Janus is running a big-time private sector trade organization in CalBroadband, a very influential industry group in Sacramento, California. Janus is tough, well-trained, experienced, cross-pollinated between issue areas, well-educated, humble, and always eager to grow and learn from others too. But today, sir, we get to learn from you. Janus Norman, where are you today? And say hello to the people of Together at the Top.
Well, thank you. Appreciate the opportunity. I am joining you from Sacramento, California.
Very cool. Welcome. So let's just jump right into it. I have pages of notes and I've been geeking out about this interview. So let's just jump right into the profile of a young, smart, super motivated young professional. So you're 25, you're on scene at a young age. How did you get to these influential seats?
Thanks for that wonderful description. We'll try to live up to that billing. I've been really fortunate to have really good mentors and people that have looked out for my continued growth and development. I entered into the public policy space really through an internship. I was interning my junior or sophomore year of college with a public sector employee union called AFSCME, the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, under the tutelage of really one of my most impactful, influential mentors, Willie Pelote. And he created an internship program that really looked at exposing college level upperclassmen or recent graduates to the legislative process. You were able to analyze bills, walk with him into various meetings. Oftentimes you were viewed from outsiders as if you were just a regular staffer that worked for the International Union. But, you were still in college and an intern. And it was that sort of launched my ability to think about myself in the context of the legislative process and how to utilize the legislative process to accomplish a lot of good at a mass scale for a variety of just issues. Because that for me was the most enlightening part of working or interning with AFSCME, was the variety of issues that they impacted. Willie was really big about not just impacting the work environment that our members worked in, but also impacting the communities in which our members actually lived in, went to school in. He would say worked, played, and worshiped in. And that got me sort of on this scale of how do you utilize the legislative process sort of across the board. From there, I was able to join a prestigious fellowship program, the Jesse M. Unruh Assembly Fellowship Program. I was a fellow for then Assembly member Darrell Steinberg, who was the chair of the Assembly Appropriations Committee. I was able to work both on his personal staff and somewhat with the Appropriations Committee staff. For those that don't follow the legislative process, the Appropriations Committee analyzes the fiscal impact of a piece of legislation and then help legislators determine if they're going to move that bill on through the process based on how much it costs. And that's where sort of my notion of, again, it's really about how do you implement change and implement policy versus the policy discussion for me that like piqued my interest there.
So one of the questions I have for you is you mentioned early on getting yourself into these meetings in college. What did you see when you got in there? You said you started to see a path for yourself. What did you see? What did you experience? What did you feel in some of these early meetings?
Early on, what was really cool about one, working with Willie Pelot and then working with Daryl Steinberg and his whole team was you got to be a fly on the wall. They took me, Andrea Jackson, the chief of staff, Kathleen Dressler, the ledge director at the time for Daryl Steinberg, they took me into all of the meetings. And, they introduced me, this is my intern or this is my fellow. He's just here to sit and learn. And eventually I got really good at fading into the background where I don't think most of the time people remembered that I was there and the meetings got really candid. And so what I saw was, one, relationships matter. People having a way of effectively communicating with the other party they're negotiating with or trying to work through a problem. All the important meetings started with people speaking about their relationship, their time they spent together, what they had in common, how they were approaching that discussion through their commonalities. The second part was you didn't need to be an absolute expert in every issue as long as you weren't afraid to ask for help and bring in people with expertise. And really being comfortable in your position as, the ultimate decision makers, the leaders, but not driving yourself to be, having to be, I'm the smartest person in the room on every individual subject. When Mr. Steinberg was the chair of Appropriations Committee, that committee could see easily 1,200, 1,400 bills come through that committee on every single policy area that the legislature will deal with. And while he was very well versed in a multitude of issues, there's no way that he could be an expert in all of the issues. And his ability to ask the right questions, bring in the right people, be comfortable with having people who, quote unquote, were smarter than him in a particular area, speak up and give their opinion and guidance, and then him take that guidance and direction and sort of lead the discussion was really impactful for me. Same thing for Willie Pelot. The members of AFSCME were from everywhere, from agriculture inspector aides to physicians that provided healthcare services in correctional facilities, to your school bus drivers, all the way to your mental health professionals working in the state hospitals. And while there was a common thread of employer-employee relationships, the particulars, there was no way he could know all of it. And again, he had a similar pattern of how do I bring in experts? How do I bring in people with that day-to-day experience? And his job was, how do I lead the discussion? How do I make sure I have the relationships? So when I can connect the two people together or the parties together that really understood the details, they can get that policy right. And they were comfortable with that style of leadership. And that really impacted me. So that's what I saw really was how do you develop relationships that you can utilize? And how are you comfortable as a leader, not knowing everything, but knowing where to find everything and knowing what your skill set that you bring to the table?
And you're 22, 23 years old. Not even that, you're in college. You're 20, 21 at this time.
Yeah.
And you're having thoughts and seeing things you have not seen before or thought before is my guess.
That was the other aspect of, especially with Willie, his capacity to tolerate my questions was unbelievable. Early on, as you could imagine, there were discussions and processes that I just had no clue what was happening. And his ability to be patient and take me from step one to step two, and then demand the next time I saw those conversations not to go back to step one, but to start at step two and then push myself to step three, so that he guided me to get more sophisticated in the questions that I asked in order to demand that I get more sophisticated in my understanding of the legislative process and the issues that we were dealing with.
Holy smokes, that's good. One of my favorite books, just as an aside, it's called Willie Brown. I think it's by a gentleman named Richardson, who was a Capitol reporter. It's one of the most impactful business books I've ever read. You don't have to know Willie Brown, our famous former Speaker of the Assembly, either famous or infamous, depending on how you think about him. But boy, the leadership lessons from the way he grabbed mentors. So I'm really impressed by what you're talking about in terms of progressing from the steps. And we'll talk about in coaching. I'll talk about in coaching, looking for pattern and practice. And it fits in there as I want you to progress. I'm not going to go backward and teach the same lesson. So if you got that lesson, we'll continue to progress. Give me a sense, Janus, in your early career, like let's say first 10 years, what words was you use to describe yourself in your first 10 years of your actual career?
Hardworking. My parents really wanted to make sure I had a work ethic. My mom grew up in rural Louisiana, grew up in a family that was sharecroppers. So my mom, these aren't the words she would use, but often would relate whatever activity we were doing with working in the fields, picking cotton. And when my brother and I have an older brother, when we would complain about something being hard, right? This is not hard. Getting up before the crack of dawn, picking cotton is hard.
Wow.
So that gives you a drive. My dad, very entrepreneurial in spirit, takes after his father, who was entrepreneurial in spirit, held multiple jobs, and just sort of watched and was compelled, I'll use that word, to emulate being willing to get up and get your hands dirty and put in the time, pay your dues was a phrase that my family really embraced and was instilled upon me in an early time. So hardworking. The other place, and I'm trying to think of the word, I can't think of the one word, but I really had a skill of quickly figuring out where to go to get information and not being afraid to utilize that network of resources to help me execute whatever the assignment was that I had. And then third, I would say I was just unapologetically willing to just tell people what I don't know and ask them for help. My favorite phrase my first year in the building was, my name is Janus. I'm a fellow. I don't know anything. Please help. And oftentimes when you approach people from that place of, I view you as an expert, I don't know what I don't know, and will you be willing to help me? I found that a lot of people were willing to spend a lot of time when they didn't need to and energy trying to make sure that I was aware of what information was foundational so that I could be competent, and then where to go to find deeper levels of expertise. That for me would be how I would describe myself. And then energetic, enthusiastic. I found the legislative process, I still find the legislative process to be absolutely fascinating. A process that drives opposing views to come together and drives decision makers to determine what is going to be the best course of action based on all of the different opposing views, different points of information, and then trying to figure out what's in the best interest of your constituency, and then how your constituencies grow from your district to your county to the entire state. That aspect of a legislative process has fascinated me and continues to captivate my imagination.
I mean, that's curiosity, and it's interest, and you're earnest, and that translates to business also, because a lot of what's interesting about the story you're telling and we're learning is you don't stay in the legislature. You take these skills and you start to push them out to other areas, and we'll get there. But I put a couple words on top of your phrases. Earnest, I mentioned. Curious. I love energetic and enthusiastic. I was writing down when I was working on some of the questions I wanted to ask you, how would I answer that? And the first thing I wrote down was super competitive and hyper driven. So similar. Tell me on the flip side. So I'm assuming you made some mistakes in the first 10 or so years. What would you tell us about your early years when you're smoothing out, becoming the much more refined badass that you are, quite frankly?
I will say that I try to make fewer mistakes, but constantly making mistakes and learning from them, not being afraid of making mistakes. There's something I also learned early on, right? Those are growth opportunities. My early on mistakes were usually because I was rushing. They were usually about, I just wanted to move on to the next activity, move on to the next assignment. And I didn't take the time to properly communicate what needed to be communicated to a legislator or their office. Didn't properly take the time to think 2-3 steps down the line about a particular issue. And then that sort of comes back to bite you.
Expediency, really. You were trying to get through it because you want to move on to the next one.
Yeah, I remember one particular occasion. I was working in the budget, and I came to the budget process as a budget consultant, not really having a finance or an economics background. I came through it from sort of a legislative office, and really took interest in public safety issues. Really took interest in transportation issues, and really was just sort of learning how to put budgets together and work with the good folks over at the Department of Finance and the Legislative Analyst Office that helped me figure out the numbers. But I remember on one particular occasion, I had to put together a spreadsheet for our chief consultant who was putting it into a larger spreadsheet for the speaker and for the budget chair. And when I tell you I put together the worst spreadsheet imaginable, that it was really bad. And part of the reason that it was really bad was he verbally outlined sort of what he wanted the spreadsheet to look like. And I just didn't have experience putting together spreadsheets. And so I put together a spreadsheet and none of the numbers added together. The formulas were all messed up. And we're in the crunch time of the process. And I still interact with them today and hold them in such high regard. But the chief consultant, Chris Wood at the time, comes into my office and he basically lets me have it. He's like, "What is this? We've got to turn this around in 2 hours. I don't know what this is." And just sort of just tosses his hands up. It's like, "Figure this out." And I just remember at that moment, like saying to myself, "Oh, I guess I should have asked some questions." I guess I really should have honed in on understanding sort of the details, but I just wanted to get on to a lot of pressing deadlines, agendas to write and things of that nature. But it was the fact that I didn't take the time to really understand the assignment. And now I was holding up really the work product of the Assembly Budget Committee, and then quickly figured it out and went to one of my colleagues and said, "Again, I'm new here. I don't know what I'm doing. Help me out."
Hi, my name is Janus Norman.
And again, good people were faithful and compassionate enough to help me out. There was a lot of those.
Yeah, I think you'll be surprised how useful this is to our listeners. We have a growing listener base in the 20 to 35-year-old range. And I do a fair amount of coaching at your level, but also with emerging leaders. And I don't know how to ask. And I've never been here before is a major thing we work on. Because every time you ascend, you don't know again. And so learning how to learn, whether it's first it's high school, then you got to redo it in college, and then you have to learn how to learn professionally. We appreciate your time. If you like what you've heard so far, do me a favor and leave a 5-star review and share with your friends. We'll be right back. The law firm of Scholes, Brick & Rogaski is a go-to partner for me. I work the most with partner Michael Rogaski. I go to them for business contracts, strategic legal counsel to maneuver through or around complex business situations, HR and employee issues, startup needs, intellectual property protections, collection matters, and recently the purchase or sale of a business. I really like the fact they tell me if they're not the best fit and they give me a warm referral if I need it. Also, unlike so many attorneys, are totally level-headed and calm. I've experienced it like their slogan says, small firm service, large firm result. Contact Michael Rogaski at sbrlawsd.com. Kathy Olson at Ships and Trips is as creative and as willing a travel partner as you can find. These days, you can plan a lot of trips on your own, but for those trips that require more intricate planning, tons of time, or local contacts and savvy, Kathy's the best. My family and friends have worked with her countless times in every travel country, setting, and season you can think of. Contact Kathy with a C at shipsandtripstravel.com. Let me switch gears on you, Janus. You mentioned sharecropping, and for those of you watching on video, on audio, you may not know, Janus is an African-American young man, and I would love to hear and just have an opportunity to learn from you. And with your indulgence, I'd like to level set with a sobering stat or two and just get your comment against this. And thank you to our research team. Quote, Black professionals from 2018 to 21 held just 3.3% of all executive and senior leadership roles, 3.3%. Which are defined as within 2 reporting levels of the CEO, according to the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. We talked about you being influential at a young age. Talk about how being Black has impacted you in the legislature and business. We would really appreciate an opportunity to learn from you in this regard, Janus.
Yeah, I grew up in a family in a larger community that quickly instilled an expectation of what it takes to really be successful and to move into places where you don't see a lot of African-American or Black representation. Very much grew up with the adage of, I've got to be twice as good just to go as far as my white counterpart. But what I was grateful for in my family was it didn't come from a place of bitterness. It came from, this is the world that we live in. We have an obligation to do our best to position ourselves to make the world a better place. And this is what you need to do in order to put yourself in that position. And so the expectation of you don't have the built-in familial networks, right? Generations of people that have been in and around Sacramento, or generations of people that have been in and around, corporate atmospheres or corporations that can help you get into the front door. Oftentimes you're the person that's either the first or the second individual through that front door. And so one, you've got to learn how to operate in different environments, different communities, different settings. You've got to be hyper aware, not only of how you're being viewed and how you could be perceived. You're walking into rooms with the understanding of, I'm still relatively young, but even when I was younger, I was walking into rooms where I was the only African-American person in the room, and I was making the decisions. And for some people, that could be unsettling. For some people, it wasn't the fact that I was Black that was the problem. It's the fact that I was young. That was the problem. And how are you going to create a relationship in which the individuals have to respect that you know your stuff? Because even if they don't respect, quote unquote, me, they have to respect the fact that the people who put me in that room trust the fact that I know my stuff. And I've demonstrated that I know my stuff and I'm able to execute the assignment that's been given to me. And from that basis of respect, you can work with anyone. But I've been really fortunate. I have been in places where people have been looking for diversity and I've been prepared. I've been in places where I've had to bust down the door because, they weren't looking to be diverse. So it's been an interesting journey, but it starts with the fact that in my head, I know I've got to be twice as good. And that's not a bone of contention or a place of bitterness for me. It's just the reality of what you have to do in order to be successful. As you mentioned before, I am hyper competitive. We grew up in a sports family. We learned a lot of life lessons through sports. And one of the things that you learn through sports is talent is sort of God-given, but your ability to perfect that talent so that you turn it into being highly skilled. And when you're highly skilled and you've got an opportunity to display that you're highly skilled, it's very hard for people to block your entry into rooms and into sitting at tables where your skills demand that you should be in that room or sitting at that table.
Really interesting. I mean, I may not be asking the right questions. Like, what should I be asking you about this that I'm not asking? Like, one thing is, are you constantly conscious of it? Because in a way, it surprises me, but I knew there was something there, which is why I want to ask the question. You brought up your humble beginnings. Like, you want to know about hard work? I'll tell you about hard work. Are you always conscious of it? Are there other things I should be asking where we can learn from you? Because this is really, really impactful to hear you talk about it this way.
Yeah, I am consciously conscious of it. I will say I was fortunate. I'll just give it to you in the context of the legislature, right? Because it's a world that you and I came from. And I happened to be at a time that bridged sort of old school and new school. If you define old school by pre-term limits, new school by term limits, right? And you and I have heard the stories, right, of legislators or iconic figures coming in to the building and yelling at people and being highly emotional on certain topics. I was always aware that, quite frankly, I couldn't get highly emotional or loud in certain settings, right? Because I could be viewed as or discounted as just being an angry Black person. And so I was always tried to be aware of what was my emotions, what is my facial expressions, how do you communicate in nonverbal ways? You know, I would use my facial expressions to sort of display displeasure or frustration, right? But I try not to raise my voice. I try not to get really super animated because those could all be taken the wrong way. I've only had a few circumstances where that's gotten, in one in particular, where an issue sort of triggered me and I sort of lost it, and I had, you know, somebody help bring me back. But it is something that you have to be cautious of, and you have to be really aware. And I know some people who view that differently, and sort of say, you know, I am who I am, and I should be able to engage and express myself the way I want to. I don't think those individuals are wrong. It's just the way I go about it. So it is a constant point. And the other reason it's a constant point is what I mentioned earlier, which is I might be the second or second person that sits in a seat or sits in a room. And I'm trying to think about how do I bring more individuals that are competent and ready and add diversity to that room. And in order to be thinking about how do I add diversity to that room, you know, I've got to be conscious of the fact that I'm currently probably the only diversity in that room. And what did it take for me to get there? And how do I help others get there? And how are you just being conscious of how do you build teams, and tables, and rooms? There's a saying that I recently came across that one of my friends was mentioning to me about it's okay to be the first, but it's not okay to be the last. And it's that sort of mentality that becomes the second reason why I'm always aware of it. So it's there.
Yeah, I cannot thank you enough for your expression and opportunity to learn from you and others to learn from you. Let me switch gears a little bit and let's talk about power and influence. You came from power, not absolute power, but you had a lot of power. Being in power, I should say. You're working for the majority party. You're a major budget writer in the fourth largest economy in the world. Then you go and you join the union. You work for the California Medical Association. Now you're with a beast of a group, a really influential group, CalBroadband, but you're not in power. You have power and influence, but you're not in power. Talk about the dichotomy of the difference between being in power and having power and influence. How are you experiencing that, Janus?
Yeah. In one sense, I've always viewed sort of in the way you sort of describe it, like if you're in power, you're the decision maker or one step removed away from the decision maker. When I was a budget staffer and on personal staff, I was one step away from the decision maker, right? I was providing recommendations to the legislature and they were taking their actions. And so in that recommendation, there was a significant power in your ability to influence, frame the issue and what a legislator was going to do. In the seats now that I've had from an advocacy standpoint, it is about influence and persuasion, right? And for me, it was a big learning curve. I remember I left the legislature to go work for Judicial Council, which is still in state government. And I left to be in their Office of Government Affairs, and I was their budget lobbyist and dealt with everything. I used to call it facilities, everything outside of the courtroom. And I just remember the difference in how people treated me the next week. A lobbyist that, laughed at my jokes, always sought my attention, now wouldn't even return my phone call because the dynamics of the relationship had shifted. And I couldn't, I didn't have the power that they needed in order to execute their jobs and assignments. That was like the first time that I sort of saw the difference between, I moved from the seat of the decision maker to the seat of a major influencer. And then really sort of said, well, what does it mean to be a major influencer? How do I, again, build the relationships? How do I make sure I have all of the background material so that when I speak with credibility? I make arguments. And then, quite frankly, how do I identify and or develop those levers of political influence or power that will call, like politics? I don't know of another way to describe it, but those different levers that you'll have access to. And I remember how that even changed when I was with the Judicial Council. It was all about the relationships the justices or judges had with elected officials, including the governor or the speaker or the pro tem. And it was really local politics and local retail relationships. When I moved to AFSCME, it was about, the influence and power of the public sector employee unions, right? We had actual voting constituents in people's districts. We contributed to campaigns. We worked campaigns. And so you were able to play, quote unquote, power politics in addition to relationship politics. And the same thing was substantially similar when I was the chief lobbyist and political director for the California Medical Association, which was another tremendous group and opportunity that had a long legacy and continues to have, a thriving advocacy program about, how do you tie things together? And that's what really allows you to be successful. And then the third component of it is you have to think ahead and you have to think through or scheme out or game out the entire scenario when you're on the influencing seat. You don't really have to do that when you're in the decision-making seat because you're the one that's making the decision. And when you're trying to game out, it really causes you to think comprehensively about, again, if I approach a decision maker in one way, what is the universe of reactions they could have? And then you go through the scenarios of those universe of actions, right? And then you see if that's the outcomes that you want. If it's not the outcomes you want, you got to sort of go back to the beginning. So a lot of time spent, planning and discussing and thinking through what the scenarios are so that you can anticipate what's going to happen.
It's really interesting. You and I have talked about in our discussions together, our executive discussions together, that it's really helpful. It was helpful to me as an executive business coach and now an advisor to businesses big and small and both emerging leaders and leaders like you to go through that process in the legislature. And now you've taken it to business. So now you're a business leader. You came up through regulatory, legal, and legislative affairs. Many top executives come through IT or sales and operations. How do you think regulatory and legislative affairs tracks serve you as a training ground for your work now as a top executive?
First and foremost, it helps you understand relationships. Relationships matter. Relationships are paramount because relationships build trust. And when you're in a leadership position, so I'm president of the trade association, my job is really about how do I point this organization in the right direction and lead the organization to where it needs to be in the future to be most effective for the members that participate in our trade association. And so a lot of that is about what do I think the future is going to look like? And as you're sort of describing and painting that vision, I think is the phrase that people like to utilize now as you're casting the vision. That vision is only effective or it's only believable. Let me say it that way. It's only believable if my board or executive committee believes in me, trust me that what I'm seeing and I'm able to articulate to them what I'm seeing really adds up to the future or the opportunities or the risks that I see before the organization. So that's one. Two, I had talked about that planning process, right? Thinking through the various scenarios and thinking about how do you game it out, for lack of a better term. If I present something this way, is that going to be effective? Is that going to be persuasive? What do the different decision makers sitting around the table need? And, where do I start? Where do I end? All those types of things in really sort of strategic thinking of leading people to decision making. When you think about advocacy in the legislative process or lobbying in the legislative process, you're really participating in a decision making process. And how can you effectively get people to that place? Third, for me, has been quickly becoming competent in a number of different issue areas. And then underneath that, knowing where to find the experts who have a deeper knowledge in each of those issue areas, or not issue areas, but skill sets. So having a diversity of understanding of certain topics and skill sets, and then finding people with a greater level of expertise in those skill sets is what I found to be really, really helpful. If I was sort of thinking about those three things, it's those, and those translate well. I think the other thing that translates well, and this is going to sound a little, is the ability to walk into a room and own a room and be really confident in what you bring to the table and understand how to captivate a room. And that's really hard to teach. It's developed, right? And how one individual captivates a room is very different than the way another individual will captivate a room. And being comfortable in your own skin, your own identity, that allows you to be able to captivate that room is something that has benefited me well.
Yeah, that's a great observation. I actually used that for myself the other day because you and I have different jobs, but we came from similar places. You know, not the same places, similar places, and I am doing more and more work on site. And I noted to somebody the other day, my experience with microphones in big rooms, leading big boards, being confident is really helping me right now. From where I wear to where I sit to, like, I am comfortable in that situation because of that training I had.
And you think through all of it. Just think about what you wear, what's in your hands. The number of times when I was at CMA or even at AFSCME, but more so when I was the chief lobbyist at the California Medical Association, there were certain meetings, if they were going to be the final negotiation meetings or the setup to the final negotiation meetings, and I was bringing a staffer or a different expert, I would consciously not bring something, right? Because decision makers don't bring
binders,
right? Decision makers aren't taking notes, right? And so the business we come from trains us in that way to think about, you know, what is the perception you're giving off right when you walk through the door? Are you on time and walking in comfortable? Are you late and running in out of breath? And what does that mean?
Do you know what the meeting's about? Are you prepared for the meeting? Or like, hey, I'm sorry, I'm super busy. What are we meeting about? Which you hear, and I'm never impressed by that.
Right. So it's been a really good training ground. In many ways, I feel those things are intangibles. Like, you can't learn those things from a book. I was fortunate enough to go back and get my MBA because I felt like I needed some more hard skills, needed to understand. I hadn't really dealt with budgets. And so, you know, how do you deal with the accounting aspects of the job? Or how do you deal with IT and operations and thinking about operations? But those things in many ways can be taught in a much easier fashion than the 4 items we mentioned earlier that are developed over time, or quite frankly, innate to different people's personalities.
Yeah, for sure. Really good, Janus. Yeah, we could do an hour on this part alone, but we probably shouldn't. We appreciate your time. We'll be right back. Three Bridges Consulting did the video on the recently rebranded nickwarnerconsulting.com. I really love the video because it helps me sell by speaking directly to my prospective clients. Dennis and Sean at Three Bridges Consulting are high-level storytellers for the purpose of helping my prospective coaching clients understand what differentiates me from the pack. A recent new coaching client literally said to me, "You don't need to sell me, Nick. Your video sold me. I understand what you do and how you work with me as a client." That is a true story. You know I love that. Contact 3BC at threebridgesconsulting.co. Ken and his team at Connect Strategies head up my post-rebrand digital marketing campaign. I'm moving up the rankings for business coaches and consultants quickly. Connect is 20 years in the business, and I feel like they're really focused on my account. I refer business coaching clients to Connect too, and I get really good reports on result, professionalism, and drive. Thank you, Connect. Contact Ken at KNECHT strategies.com. You haven't been shy about making moves. We chronicled some of them you just did in terms of the number of jobs you've had in your career. All of them seem to land you a step or two higher up the ladder in some new and uber relevant policy area. Let me set the stage for some questions I want to ask you. I want to get your input for others behind you on how you're thinking about this. And so you've taken, again, that route of moving on to move up. Now you're way up as president of a major trade association in a hot technology sector. So I'd say it's worked for you as a strategy, if that's what it was. Why did you move on and move up? And what advice would you give others in this space?
Well, let me tackle the first question first. The reason why I moved on was for the ability to move up. It's for opportunities. Early on, I'll credit a lot of it to my dad and the mentality that he sort of gave to myself and to my brother, which was all about, you think about the next job in trying to get you to the job that you want to be. And so how do you view yourself? And then how do you take opportunities and positions that give you the options at the next step to get closer to how do you view yourself? Early on, I figured out that I wanted to lead institutions. I wanted to be guiding political institutions, advocacy institutions that focused on how do you improve individuals' lives in some aspect. That was really in my career from a policy standpoint. That's the through line. Every position I've taken has had an ability to improve people's lives in some form or fashion. So when I was in the legislature, quite frankly, I had my dream job. My dream job was to be a budget consultant. It's all I wanted to be. When I first entered into the building, I thought I was going to be there for 40 years. Term limits happens, family obligations happen, burnout happens, quite frankly, because I was in the budget during 2008 when there was significant economic downturns. And we were doing multiple budgets in a year, and the grind was really tough. And so I had to think about, okay, where do I want to see myself? And if I stay in this space, will I have the opportunity to move to something that will give me the talking points on the resume to make my interview for the position I want next compelling? And so that's why I made the move. And so for me, I felt like I needed to understand, I always wanted to understand the budget process, and I wanted to understand it from the executive branch side, but be as close to it as possible, which is actually why I went to the judicial branch, because I could get closer to the budget process than if I went and worked for the Department of Finance or the Department of Corrections. I was too many steps removed. In the judicial branch, I worked directly with the head director of finance for the judicial branch, as well as the chief administrator. And I was in on those discussions.
And these are billion-dollar discussions for those listening who don't understand the scope and scale we're talking about.
Oh, yeah. So I wanted to be close to that. And then as I felt like I understood that, mastered that, I wanted to, quite frankly, understand power politics and broaden that scope. Because if I understood relationship politics at the judicial branch, I understood how to make an argument like an attorney a little bit at the judicial branch, and then that budget aspect. And then it asked me, I was able to combine that with power politics and trying to sort of modify some different practices and bridge what Willie was doing as my mentor into sort of the new version of the legislature versus sort of the old school version of the legislature. And then when I got to CMA, it was about, can I run my own operation? Could I be an executive? And my CEO that I worked for, he's still there now, Dustin Corcoran, came to be the executive coming out of being the chief lobbyist for the organization. And I felt like, and he was, and is, he would be a fantastic mentor to showcase to me and to push me from being a great lobbyist to being a competent executive. And so each move was about, how do I get to the position I'm in now, which is about leading an institution and being at the helm of that institution and trying to direct it. How do you protect its members? How do you allow the members to do what is good for the people of California? And in this context, it's all about, connectivity to high-speed internet. Internet's the backbone for everything that we're doing nowadays, whether you think about entertainment, education, healthcare, jobs in the economy. Everything is linked back to broadband and broadband availability. And the revelation of that is relatively new. And so being in the midst of that attracted me to this position. But the reason I felt like I was prepared is because each step of the way, I was willing to look to the next job. And the advice I would give to people is always think about options. I think oftentimes when you're with an organization, you understand the value that you bring to the organization and you have a trajectory of upward advancement that you feel your value is worth. And oftentimes that's in conflict with what's actually the available opportunity within that organization. One of the lessons that I had to learn at CMA, and one of the things that we took great pride in at CMA, is that we got poached a lot. People came to our organization looking for competent people and pulled competent people out of our organization. For us, that was a badge of honor. One, because there's only so many spots at the top. So, if you wanted to be a chief lobbyist at the organization, you're probably going to need to leave. And that wasn't a source of contention or bitterness for the organization. It really taught me that, right? How do you bring people in? How do you train them? How do you let them maximize their time with you? And then if they get an opportunity to advance and that means that they have to leave the organization, that's fine. We throw them a party and wish them well. And we continue talking to them because now our network has grown. And I just think younger folks just have a reluctance, right? Of saying, well, I'm here at organization A and I'm doing a really good job. And so you should just promote me. And really the opportunities within an organization, unless you've got people leaving that organization or they're opening up into new geographic areas, you really have to consider switching employers in order to get that move up. The one thing I would caution about that is moving too fast. It is a weird mix between people who are taking advantage of opportunities to move up and people that are creating a track record of instability. And so you really want to make sure that you're not maneuvering in a way that creates a track record of instability, but you're really, showcasing people that I was at this place, I mastered this skill set at this place. That skill set has created me to be ready to take on this challenge, mostly at a new place.
Yeah. So we're in the fourth quarter now, getting toward the end of the game, and I want to summarize some of the things I learned from you. But before I do that, I have a few last questions for you, which is around, the jobs you've had, Janus, the job you have now, you don't have to tell me and you don't tell me, but I know they're stressful and I know they impact you. Talk about how you handle stress and also the role of family in your life.
Yes, the jobs are stressful, but in many ways, they're stressful because they're meaningful, right? They're stressful because you're having an impact. And for me, that becomes motivation. So oftentimes, I view stress as just energy. And you can either allow that energy to stay within your system and result in bad actions, or you can think about what is causing you to have anxiety and then put your energy to working to relieving that checklist of things that's causing you to have anxiety or stress. And then you got to have some outlets. And for me, that's family. For me is the outlets. I spend most of my time when I'm not in the office in and around my kids. I have all teenagers. I've got a 17-year-old girl. I've got a 15-year-old boy and a 13-year-old girl. They are engaged in a lot of different activities. And so I spend a lot of time playing Uber. And then I spend the rest of that time being the loudest, most obnoxious cheerleader that I can be. And trying to make sure that in those moments, how do you create memories that last is really how I spend a lot of my time. Because for me, when I look at family and start connecting dots, and my wife helps me with this a lot and views life in really the same ways. It's, you've got our parents before us, we're sitting there in the middle, and you got our kids after us, right? And so the question becomes, how do we put them in a situation where they can advance past us or advance past our parents? And how do we make those investments? And so trying to make sure they're engaged, out of trouble, and then messing with them a lot, just teasing them relentlessly or making them. I tell my son all the time, My greatest joy is embarrassing. Just making him, blush and be annoyed. That is my favorite pastime. So family becomes a place of support. Honestly, the other thing it becomes is a place of accountability. I am very lucky that I have a wife that is much smarter than me. She's in this world as well, but she's able to sort of think through things. I can bounce things off of. She can point out what I'm missing. She's really good at silence when I'm saying something that doesn't make sense and sort of looks at me. That's her way of asking questions. And so having that kind of partnership is really, really helpful. So family for me has been support and then that stress relief.
So good. So good. The way you talk about it's helpful to me. And I've had to remind myself a couple times during this interview, hey, Nick, you're leading a podcast. This is not a one-on-one where Janus is coaching you and telling you how to think about things. Snap out of it. Really good. So before I summarize some of my takeaways, and if the pattern holds, I'll be on a bike somewhere listening to this interview, rethinking about it. You've really given me a lot and our listeners a lot to think about. But before I summarize, the professional world is really in the palm of your hands at this point. I mean, that's not you saying it. That's me observing it. What really drives you at this stage of your life and career, Janus? And what do you still want to get better at?
This is going to sound, well, I'm just going to say it. What drives me is trying to meet the standard that my grandfathers have set for me. Both of my grandfathers, in my mind, right, maximize their opportunities and potential in their own ways. My mom's side was in rural Louisiana. My dad's side was in San Diego. And so there's different opportunities based on those settings, but they maximized their potential, maximized their opportunities. Not to say that they were perfect in any way, shape, or form, but that's the impression that I have of my grandfathers. And then when I look at my parents, they did the same thing, maximize their opportunities, maximize their potential, regardless of where they started in life. One of my fondest memories, Nick, is literally walking across, and I can't remember how old I was, walking across the graduation stage with my mom. She didn't graduate college until she was, into her 30s, but didn't let that hold her back. Wanted a career, pursued a career, had a family, took really good care, her and my dad took really good care of myself, and then went back, got her education, and then celebrated it with us. And was a point of pride, right? It wasn't something that was hidden. It was something of, this is important. I didn't get it, but I want you to know that it's important. And so I'm doing it, right? And so when I look at my parents, they sort of, again, followed in meeting that expectation or that standard set by my grandfathers. And that's the standard I want to set for my kids is, did I maximize my opportunities and did I maximize my potential? And that could be in whatever they want to do. That to me is actually not important. It's just the fact that they get the most out of their abilities and the most out of their time. For me, that means at this moment is, can I master being a really good executive? I think my time at the California Medical Association and under the mentorship of Dustin, I'm competent at being an executive, but I want to be a really good executive. And that means, how do you lead an organization where it needs to go? How do you have a larger impact on the community in which you reside in? And then how do you act as a mentor for those individuals that are coming behind you? If you can do those three things, you're an excellent executive. And, I still have growth in all of those areas, but that's what drives me is I don't think I've arrived yet. I think I'm in the room or I'm on a flight path to get there. But I don't think I've landed that plane. And that's what drives me to get up every morning. So as long as you have that drive to get up every morning, you're excited about coming into work, you're excited about the various meetings on your calendar, you're excited about the extra hours that you got to do, making sure that you're prepared for those meetings on your calendar, then you're headed in the right direction in terms of what your passions are. And I think a lot of times, when people talk about pursuing your passion, I think that gets missed. Your passion is really about, how do you see yourself and are you there yet? And if you're not there yet, how do you get there? It's not about what, quote unquote, a particular job, but it's about when you think about what is the best version of you and have you accomplish that? And what can you do to accomplish that? That's really about pursuing your passion.
So good. So good. Thanks for sharing all that with us. Your mention when we talk about power versus influence, your bifurcation of decision maker versus major influencer really caught my attention. I use the phrase in power versus having power, and decision maker as opposed to major influencer, I think is a great way to think about it. You're mentioned a couple times of power politics versus relationship politics. I think is fascinating. I've never heard it put that way. And it's not just the legislature. Almost everything we talk about translates to business, and a lot of it, some of it even to life. But power politics is obviously money, campaigns. I can try to make you do what I want by disproportionate influence. Relationship politics is just that. You trust me. I'm bringing you information. I'm trading on a relationship. It could be I'm guilting you or calling it a favor, or you just trust me. But I thought that was really interesting the way you talked about that. We talked about coming up to the legal, legislative, and regulatory side. And the things you talked about and focused on were trust-based. Yes, skills-based in terms of learning how to learn was one of the things you talked about. Gaming out scenarios is another skill set. But realizing and recognizing and learning how to use relationships and use and implement that trust. And I was really struck by, and I mentioned this during the interview, but ability to walk into a room and own it. Not everybody can do that, but what really caught my attention, Janus, is when you said people do it in different ways. It was a quarter of a sentence. I'm charismatic. You're charismatic. I'm good with a microphone. I look good in a suit, like that sort of thing. But I'm not the best guy to lay out the policy and all the numbers. And I've seen people less charismatic than me. Maybe they're not as good with people as me, but boy, they have their own way because they are really bright in their version of doing it. And I think part of the point is there's not one way to do it. There's lots of ways to do it. And I thought it was a really interesting way you discussed that.
Yeah. And being confident in your way. I think a lot of times people don't view themselves as a leader. And so they have this image of what they think a leader is. And then they try to emulate whatever that image is, right? And then all of a sudden, they become a really bad actor trying to play a character. I'm like you. I lead with, my personality. I lead with, I'm trying to find a place where we've got a common language or a common understanding.
And you also care a lot about people and doing it right. So
yes.
You listen well, you ask probative questions, you try to put people in the right position because you actually genuinely care. It's not a game.
Yeah. But if I was a policy wonk, right, and I really, really knew interesting things, then, I'd lead with that.
And that's great. You also talk about building a team around you where you're not as good, where you don't know as much, where you need a discrete subject matter expert. You also at times need a vice principal because you can't be the one pitching the fit. It's got to be somebody underneath you, and you might game that out. You talk about moving up on to move up and said a lot of interesting things that probably don't have time to cover them all because you already did. But how you view yourself was really interesting. And you knew you wanted to lead institutions. So you weren't just moving to move. You weren't just moving for money. You haven't even mentioned money, to be honest. You've mentioned, this is how I see myself. This is where I think I can make the most influence. And I'm going to try to get myself into that position. And then don't do it too fast. You mentioned more creating an atmosphere of instability. What I would say alongside of that, in addition to that, is make sure you marinate long enough. Make sure you took the appropriate lessons. Make sure you learn what does work, what doesn't work. Moving too fast means you rip yourself out before you were done marinating also. I thought that was a really interesting piece of advice. Stressful because it's meaningful. I will not forget that. That is spoken to me. I'm a feeling-based person. I feel stress and pressure. Now I feel stress and pressure thanks to you because it matters. Of course it does. And I'm using that as energy is another thing you said, which I think is really good. It's good for me, and I hope it's good for others. I'm super touched by you're trying to meet your grandfather's standards. And if we had more time, I would ask you, and I will ask you in a personal moment, what does that mean? What would they say about you? What are you trying to have them say about you? You mentioned mentors early on and fellowship. And one of the things you said that was really powerful to me was the power of being a fly on the wall at a young age. I'll advise my emerging leaders, audit the meeting, ask your boss if you can be in the meeting and not say anything, because you need to understand this. So having you play that back to me, that was really impressive. Being that fly on the wall really jumps off the page of me, Jess.
And Nick, I will say to the people sort of coming up, being able to be in the room and not say anything gets you invited into more rooms. People start feeling like you know how to handle it, right? And you know how to carry yourself. And you're not trying to show some moment where you know something. right? Or you're impacting the room differently than the people who are leading the discussion want it impacted. And so if you want those opportunities, just being a fly on the wall, I'm telling you, will get you into a lot of places for you to be able to ask questions after the meeting's over, which quite frankly, I found to be more meaningful.
Yeah. And I don't want to try to summarize your comments on being African-American, starting out and then at high levels of business. I don't want to recognize what you said. Thank you for what you said. And just a couple comments, your note of having to be twice as good. I'll just say I hear that. It's really impactful to me to hear that. And then learning how to operate in different situations, in different scenarios, in different rooms with different people. I don't think that's just an African-American thing, but knowing that's a foundational thought for you is really interesting. And again, impactful. I love, the last thing I'll say is I love your folks on maximizing what you were born with. Like I was born with, you said, God-given talent. And then you said, my job is, and I'm going to make my grandfathers proud and my mom proud, to maximize that talent in whatever way it makes sense for me and what I want to do. Because that is the exercise, isn't it?
That is the exercise. Leave it all on the field is what we were taught. So that's what I'm trying to do as an adult now that I can't run up and down a field.
For sure. Janus, thank you so much. You've done a phenomenal job. Thank you for letting us learn from you. Thank you also to our producer, Daniel Link, Riley Byrne, and the outstanding team at Podigy Podcast, and my top-notch research assistant, Alex Warner. Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll see you next month on Together at the Top. Thank you so much for your time. Together at the Top thrives off listeners like you. To stay connected, follow our socials in the show notes and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. We'll be releasing our show on the last Tuesday of every month. See you next time. At Nick Warner Consulting, we exist to coach and consult motivated professionals. I meet with you on Zoom in focused 90-minute sessions, working toward your goals and developing next-level business skill sets. My job is to add value to your organization and your career. To learn more, visit www.nickwarnerconsulting.com or call me directly at 916-765-3576.